For years, Cuba has faced one crisis after another, and things seem to only be getting worse. Solutions remain elusive, leaving the country struggling for stability. Today, we'll explore why the situation in Cuba is so dire, and look at some of the biggest issues plaguing the nation, from its troubled economy to critical shortages. Economic crisis with limited support. Usually, when a country faces a prolonged economic crisis, it can turn to global organizations like the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, for financial aid and stabilization programs. These organizations are often lifelines, allowing countries in need to borrow the funds necessary to rebuild. However, Cuba's troubled history with the IMF complicates its access to such assistance. Back in the 1960s, Fidel Castro borrowed from the IMF but later clashed with the organization, leading to Cuba's current inability to seek aid. Without IMF support, Cuba has missed out on the $10 billion that could have potentially mitigated its economic woes, and it has limited access to other similar institutions like the World Bank. This isolation has only deepened Cuba's economic instability, leaving it with few options for recovery. Income shortages and import dependency. Cuba, as an island nation, depends on imports for most essentials, including food and medicine. However, a combination of income shortages and a struggling economy has hindered its ability to purchase what it needs. Cuba lacks the industry and economic infrastructure to produce enough on its own, making its dependence on imports all the more pressing. Unlike countries with diverse economies, Cuba's limited export market and financial resources mean it's often unable to secure enough supplies, leading to shortages and depriving citizens of even basic necessities. The island's geographical limitations amplify the impact, as importing goods becomes a matter of survival rather than convenience. Prolonged power outages. One of the most challenging issues Cubans face is the frequent, prolonged power outages that have become part of daily life. Blackouts lasting up to 14 hours are common, and they affect everything from businesses to hospitals, making it nearly impossible for the economy to function normally. These outages also interfere with water pumps, leading to additional problems like water shortages. During Cuba's hot summer months, these outages make life nearly unbearable as people lose access to air conditioning and fans. The country's outdated power grid and reliance on oil-based plants make these blackouts hard to avoid, and they signal a much deeper infrastructure crisis. The economic conditions in Cuba have driven a mass migration crisis, with the population dropping drastically in recent years. From 2022 to 2023 alone, the population declined by around 18%, and more people are leaving every day. Many Cubans are fleeing to nearby countries like the United States, seeking stability and opportunities they no longer feel are possible in Cuba. This emigration further strains the island's workforce as young, skilled workers depart, leaving behind an aging population. As people leave, the government loses not only labor but also tax revenue, creating a cycle that makes the economic recovery even harder to achieve. Cuba's population is aging, and this demographic shift brings with it a host of economic problems. With fewer young people entering the workforce and a large percentage of the population nearing retirement, Cuba faces the challenge of supporting an increasing number of retirees. This imbalance places heavy financial pressure on the state, which will struggle to cover pensions and healthcare costs for the elderly. Cuba's lack of economic growth and employment opportunities means there aren't enough jobs to draw young people, compounding the population decline as youth either leave or choose not to have children, leading to fewer taxpayers in the future and an unstable financial outlook. Recently, the Cuban government has introduced a partial dollarization policy to allow some transactions in US dollars. However, they also impose stricter limits on private enterprise, rolling back prior reforms that allowed more economic freedom. Although private businesses could alleviate some of the shortages by importing essential goods, the government's recent pushback against these businesses risks stifling their potential. These restrictions reflect Cuba's return to more traditional socialist policies, limiting private enterprise even as citizens suffer from shortages. The combination of limited reform and increased restrictions stymies economic development, preventing the private sector from helping meet citizens' needs. A relatively new and concerning issue in Cuba is the rise in drug use. While Cuba has historically enforced strict drug policies, the recent economic hardships have led to a shift, with more Cubans turning to drugs to cope. This rise in drug consumption is troubling not only for public health, but also for social stability. Cuba's strict laws on drugs and low tolerance for crime mean that increased drug use puts a strain on the country's legal and health systems. The current economic desperation has driven many to take drastic measures to survive, and this uptick in drug use adds yet another layer of difficulty for the government to manage. Cuba's outdated energy infrastructure heavily relies on oil, a dependency established when the Soviet Union supplied Cuba with cheap oil during the Cold War. Later, Venezuela took over as a supplier, providing oil at favorable rates due to shared political interests. However, Venezuela's economic struggles have cut Cuba off from this affordable oil, forcing the country to buy on the international market, which is significantly more expensive. With no affordable oil supply, Cuba has been unable to maintain consistent electricity, leading to blackouts and disruptions. These challenges highlight the fragility of Cuba's energy sector, which lacks the resources to transition to renewable energy sources. Decades of U.S. sanctions have further isolated Cuba economically. When Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union in the 1960s, the United States responded by cutting trade ties and imposing economic sanctions. These restrictions have had lasting effects, preventing Cuba from accessing many goods and financial resources that could otherwise aid its recovery. The close proximity to the U.S. offers potential trade benefits, but the sanctions limit any collaboration, contributing to Cuba's economic stagnation. The absence of trade with the U.S. not only hurts Cuba's economy, but also restricts its options for sourcing essential goods. Alongside the power outages, Cuba faces severe water shortages affecting over 600,000 people, especially in urban areas like Havana. Many of Cuba's pipes are old, leaking, and in need of replacement. Due to a lack of funding, these issues go unresolved, leaving many without reliable access to water. The power crisis compounds the problem, as pumps can't operate without electricity, further limiting access. The lack of water impacts sanitation, hygiene, and daily life, creating unsanitary conditions and putting additional strain on the already struggling healthcare system. Food production in Cuba has plummeted, leading to widespread shortages and a dependence on imports that the government can barely afford. In 2024, beef and pork production were significantly lower than in previous years, creating a nutritional gap that puts more pressure on the already struggling population. The limited resources for agriculture, coupled with infrastructure and energy challenges, make it difficult to boost food production. This situation has made food a scarce and valuable commodity, impacting the health and well-being of the entire nation. The shortages of food, water, and basic supplies have led to increased crime and social unrest. People are forced to take extreme measures to survive, including turning to the black market or resorting to theft. This rise in crime disrupts communities and reflects the desperation many Cubans feel. Cuba's government has traditionally maintained strict law enforcement, but the current shortages and social pressures are challenging its ability to control crime. The social strain also leads to protests and civil unrest, creating a cycle that further destabilizes daily life. Dollarization and government policies. To stabilize the economy, Cuba recently adopted a partial dollarization policy, accepting US dollars for certain transactions, primarily in tourism. However, the government has also imposed restrictions on cash transactions and private business activities, hoping to retain control over the economy. This partial dollarization is seen as a short-term solution that may not address Cuba's larger economic problems. As citizens increasingly rely on the US dollar, the Cuban peso loses value, worsening inflation and reducing the government's control over the economy. Healthcare crisis and medical supply shortages. Cuba has long been known for its healthcare system, but economic decline has severely impacted access to medical supplies and medicines. Hospitals face shortages of essential drugs, equipment, and even basic sanitation products, making it difficult for healthcare professionals to provide adequate care. Adding this detail would illustrate the critical impacts of the crisis on Cuba's well-regarded health sector. Educational system strain. Cuba's education system, like its healthcare, has been a point of pride. However, economic constraints have impacted schools and universities, limiting resources, supplies, and even the ability to pay educators. Young Cubans find it increasingly difficult to pursue higher education or gain skills that could help improve the economy. This section could explain how these educational challenges contribute to the cycle of poverty and the migration of young talent. Economic dependency on tourism. Tourism has been one of Cuba's major economic drivers, but the sector has struggled due to global issues like COVID-19. as well as the limitations of U.S. travel restrictions. With a significant reduction in tourism revenue, Cuba has fewer foreign currency reserves, which further restricts imports of essential goods. Highlighting tourism's role could clarify why the economy has worsened post-pandemic, and how Cuba's reliance on tourism adds to its financial instability. The role of the black market. The black market plays a substantial role in Cuba's economy, allowing citizens to access goods and services that the government cannot provide. However, the government's push to restrict private businesses has also targeted black market activities. People often rely on this informal economy for food, medicine, and other essentials, and explaining its importance would reveal the challenges of everyday life and the limitations of government regulations. The current situation in Cuba is a complex web of economic instability, resource scarcity, and social challenges. With no immediate solutions in sight, the country faces a deeply uncertain future. Many people are choosing to leave, and those who remain are struggling to get by. As we look ahead, Cuba's ability to navigate this crisis will depend on economic reform, international support, and perhaps a major shift in government policies. Thank you for joining us in this exploration. If you found this video insightful, please like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth content.